I want to bring in MS Now's Jake Traylor, who is covering the White House. Kevin Fry is on Capitol Hill for us. And with me here in studio, retired Army Major General Spider Marks, founder and president of the Marks Collaborative and head of geopolitical strategy at Academy Securities. It's so great to have you here, General, especially after what we just heard.
Thanks, Chris.
Look, the president and Pete Hegseth are right that the United States militarily is dominant in this. There's no question about that. But you have Iran attacking, obviously, energy infrastructure. You have what we just talked about from other Gulf nations. So is it right when the Secretary of Defense says the U.S. holds all the cards here?
No, we don't. However, we are applying some immense pressure on the regime in Iran. But Iran retains the ability to withstand this pressure. We have seen zero cracks in the elites, either on the theocracy or on the IRGC and all those other mechanisms of control that have been present in Iran for the last 50 years. So they can withstand this, and they do have a pretty good supply of capabilities with their drone capabilities. They still have some missiles, although those have been attrited. And let's be frank, they don't have an Air Force that's functioning. They don't have a Navy that's really functioning. They have some.
But to say, as we heard from Scott Bessent, the regime will probably collapse on itself, is that maybe a little premature?
Well, he didn't apply a timeline. It could collapse. I mean, there are multiple scenarios where this could change. I see something like that as a very, very low probability. But over the course of time, is that a possibility? Sure, Chris. I mean, that could occur.
Yeah.
So, but it's inappropriate to say this thing is going to collapse on itself. I mean, everybody's going to draw the immediate conclusion that we're talking about the near term. That's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. There's the only way that it would happen, and as a point of historical reference,
sure.
2 secs. 1979, the Ayatollah came back from Paris, right? He went to Tehran because the protests were kicking the Shah out, but the protests gained momentum because the Air Force flipped. The conventional Air Force now was saying, we're all in on this Ayatollah thing. I think it's going to be okay. Well, it worked for them. We do not see anything like that now where the IRGC, the protectors of the revolution, or the other security infrastructure is going to flip or crack. We don't see that. So you're not going to see protests that would be demanding a change, not in the near term.
So we had originally heard at the start of this war that overall security forces surrounding this regime, including the guards, could total as many as 1 million. But do we even have any idea what's left?
Well, I think no. I think the short answer is no. I think we can do some estimations. But they are hardened. You know, Chris, over the course of 50 years, they've got muscle memory that's been built in, not only into the population to kind of persist and just try to survive, but the IRGC mechanisms of control have just increased. So we don't see any of that cracking, and the size of that, I mean, they're everywhere. They're in all the social structure. They're in the mosques. They're in the markets. They're in the schools. They're everywhere. So if this were to begin to collapse, it would have to be something like a revolution of the mid-grade officers that are the Gen Xers, right? And they say, we've watched these older commanders and leaders really kind of burnish themselves, make a bunch of money, and I'm not sure whether they're real revolutionary hardliners anymore. There would have to be something like that. And again, we would have no way to see that without having really good eyes in terms of what it looks like. And the only one who can do that is Israel.
Yeah. Kevin, DNI Tulsi Gabbard was asked whether the U.S. and Israel are on the same page when it comes to their objectives. What did she have to say?
Yeah, I mean, she essentially conceded that the goals here are different. And quite frankly, some things that I've heard from Senate Republicans in particular over the last couple of weeks have suggested that their kind of acknowledgement of where this whole conflict is going could in some ways hinge on the fact that Israel and the U.S. are not necessarily in lockstep on the long-term goal. Here was part of that exchange from this worldwide threats hearing earlier today.
What does the intelligence community assess Israel's goals in this war to be? And are those goals aligned with the goals of the United States?
The objectives that have been laid out by the president are different from the objectives that have been laid out by the Israeli government.
And how do they differ?
We can see through the operations that the Israeli government has been focused on disabling the Iranian leadership and taking out several members, obviously beginning with the Ayatollah, the supreme leader.
And how does that differ from our goals?
The president has stated that his objectives are to destroy Iran's ballistic missile launching capability, their ballistic missile production capability, and their Navy, the IRGC Navy, and mine-laying capability.
So essentially, to delineate this down to the bare minimum, the way she is arguing there is that the U.S. goal is military, focusing on their capacity, and Israel is looking much more to a political end here. She was also asked if Israel supports the president's call to make a deal with Iran. She would not answer that question. She said she didn't know. And she also asked if Israel would heed the president's call not to go after infrastructure facilities, and energy infrastructure facilities. Again, said she didn't know. The other main point of contention in this hearing today was again back to that question of how imminent was the threat posed by Iran. And what we heard today was similar to what we heard yesterday, which is that the president, in their view, according to these IC officials, intelligence community officials, is that the president gets to make that call.
Well, that has been the bottom line. The president decides when this is going to end. You could end this thing in 2 seconds if you wanted to. We just heard from the president. But, General, when you have a different set of objectives between the United States and Israel, what does that mean?
It means you get over your skis. I think what we're seeing is success following success. Israel has some immense capabilities in terms of targeting and precise intelligence. We know that. They share that with us. They've got years, and they're also standing by, and they have strike packages, whatever that looks like, to go after those targets. Well, once you have a couple of those successes, you're going, well, what next? Why don't we just kind of keep going? That's the problem. I think we started with strategic clarity and tactical brilliance, and then we got lost. I think we're going much further than we should. I mean, it's all about, in fact, what Tulsi Gabbard failed to say is anything about nukes. She said ballistic missiles development and all of that, got it. Their Navy, their Air Force, got it. But it's really about nukes. It's about ballistic missiles, and it's all about the proxies. Let's address those objectives. And then anything else, I think, and we chatted earlier, is probably unnecessarily punitive. We can keep going after those targets. We don't have to hit everything else. The ball is in the Iranian people's court to change this thing, and I'm not saying when it's going to happen anytime soon. But let's give them hope. This could happen. They can't afford to live like this. We can't afford to live with an Iran which is isolated within the region. Its neighbors don't like it. And for them to have nukes and the ability to reach over the horizon and threaten folks, not a good outcome from anybody. We can continue to apply pressure, but it's I would say we're at a transition phase, Chris, where we should go from the volume of what we see right now to let's have a sustained effort, and let's make it clear that the international community, won't tolerate this. We did that in Iraq. When we pushed Saddam back, we created an operation called Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch, and for 12 years, a coalition maritime and air campaign kept Saddam in his box. 12 years. No accidents, no problems. That could be exported over to Iran. We'll go after.
But do you see any sign that they're even considering?
I don't. And that's a political decision. I can't even opine what those pressures are political. He's got to look at his base. I mean, I'm not naive to it, but it's
well, if he looked at his base, he would have been out at the beginning because we know that this is overwhelmingly unpopular, right? But he's, again, said repeatedly that, he's got a good gut, essentially, and he's making those decisions.
I think it was popular for a while, right? I think for the first 96 hours, we saw some significant damage, and that's when it kind of started wandering a little bit.
All right, Jake, so the president's meeting today was supposed to be a celebration of the U.S.-Japanese alliance, and we did hear some nice things from the Japanese prime minister, but it really did seem a lot more like a test case of American alliances in the middle of this war. What did you see and hear?
Yeah, Chris, you're right. It was a relatively cordial meeting between the prime minister and the president that took place today. But there's a lot behind the scenes, too. In terms of what we actually heard, we heard the prime minister be very flattering of the president, saying they were going to have a cooperative, stronger relationship following this meeting. But we also saw the president asked pretty point blank, are you currently satisfied with the level of support Japan has provided to the United States in this war with Iran? And the president essentially kind of projected forward that this was going to be a really productive meeting that took place today. But this is against the backdrop of the president every single day now, publicly in the Oval Office and on Truth Social, really lambasting and going after some of these European allies for not providing more support in the safe passage of ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The president also really notably, Chris, was asked if the president was planning to have troops on the ground in Iran, if that's something we're inching closer towards. And notably, the president said, that's not something we're doing, but also if that is something we were considering, I wouldn't be telling you, the press. So not really giving clarity of an answer there. I want to play a brief sound of the president because a lot of this is, again, against a backdrop of rising oil prices globally, especially in the United States. We've talked to tons of Trump supporters who are saying they are being impacted at the gas pump right now. The president said he thought things could even be worse at the gas pump than they are right now. Take a quick listen to some of those words from moments ago.
Everything was going great. The economy was great. Oil prices were very low. Gasoline was dropping to, we had $1.99, $1.85. We had great everything. And I saw what was happening in Iran, and I said, I hate to make this excursion, but we're going to have to do it. And I actually thought the numbers would be worse.
One more moment, I think, Chris, just worth flagging that was really notable between the exchange between the president and the prime ministers. At one point, the president was asked about the conflict in Iran, about what's going on. Trump was talking about and boasting about the element of surprise in striking Iran. He then kind of quipped to the prime minister and to the Japanese foreign press saying Japan knows a lot about surprise. He then seemingly joked and said, why didn't you guys tell us about Pearl Harbor? So it's a really striking, interesting moment that took place there. Overall, I would say a cordial meeting of the two. But again, the devil's really in the details here because the two were talking kindly of each other, but also the president has really publicly said that he is not satisfied with the level of support he's received so far, and that includes Japan. The details that come out of this private meeting are going to be really interesting, Chris.